So I was recently having a debate, and a lot of people don't understand socialism with regards to ownership. You're going to hear a lot of people arguing on the so-called different types of socialism. The reality is there is only one socialism, and the argument that you have to follow is the question with regards to and consequences, how you achieve socialism, and the reason for why it cannot avoid totalitarianism. The goal of socialism, and there's no such thing as this in between with socialism, because anybody that believes other than that, they don't understand socialism. But the goal of socialism is basically to completely abolish the private sector. And if you go along with that, of course, of Marxist theory, then of course that's what socialism would be. Now, of course, you have the mixed economies, and the problem with that of parties like, of course, you take, for example, the Democrats, or you could look at another example, maybe it's the Labour Party, and they would, they would seek to nationalise something. So they might nationalise the telecommunications industry. However, once they nationalise one thing, they then look for excuses to pinpoint something that they think is a failure elsewhere. So then it's one thing after the other. It's nationalisation after nationalisation. It's done over a gradual and long time period. That's if done through gradualism. But the point that I'm addressing here with regards to socialism, you're really only going to head towards that direction if through a dictator, because it's the only way that you'll get rid of the private sector. Okay, so there's no other way for you to get rid of the private sector. It's the only way that you can do so. It's through a dictator. Someone like a Jeremy Corbyn or a Bernie Sanders might not have the gall to do it. They might not have the guts to do it, so to speak. They might get only so far, but the type of person who would take you in that direction, that would rail against economics, would be the dictator. So the reality is that going in the direction of what they wish to do in terms of abolishing the private sector, inevitably it's going to lead in the path towards dictatorship, because it requires the dictator to take you there in the first place. And of course the reason why it rails against economics is because money, again, only comes from two places: the private sector or the printing press. If you get rid of the private sector, then of course you're left with the printing press, and how are they going to finance the economy then? Of course, you've got these people who believe in this, moneyless based economy they talk about, and that's of course the theory of Marxism. But that's a whole other story. So the consequences with that is, of course, if they're running the printing press, they're going to drive the country towards hyperinflation. It's inevitable, and that's the harsh reality of what would happen. So, this is the reality of things with regards to the whole thing on socialism and whatnot. I'm sure I have been getting comments, and yes, I do. It's hello Pee-wee, and as you said, socialism means slavery by the collective state. I mean, yes, that's exactly right. There's no question of that with regards to socialism. It certainly does. And as you go on to mention, nowadays the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are both socialists. Well, to a varying degree. I mean, I would say the Conservatives are filled with these corporatists, and then they have the mixture of those who support the free market. But unfortunately, the pressure, because of society with socialism, then people demand to protect things like the state pensions or the NHS, for example, and that's the very reason why the Conservatives are under such pressure to hold these things in place. I'm sure if they had it their way, they would love to privatise certain things. But like I say, I mean, in terms of the consequences, it's one of these things. So first of all, you would need the dictator to get completely rid of the private sector. So it's never going to thing me. And you ask them the question, okay then, you ask a socialist, well, once you get to that stage, once you've completely abolished the private sector, when's the state going to wither away? You know, is the state just going to wither away? Is that a case that the state just disappears? Not the real world. That isn't the case. So that's the first thing, and I've asked the question numerous times before, with regards to socialism, and of course, when it comes to ownership, and this is the second thing in relation to this, socialism is defined by, number one, economic central planning, number two, political centralisation, number three, collective ownership or control of the means of production. So that's what defines socialism. It's a very big part of what defines socialism, and of course, whether they like it or not, state direction of the economy as a whole. So, you know, it doesn't matter whether it's the state direction even of the private sector or state subsidies, you know, that subsidise the losses of others is still part and parcel of socialism. A defining ethic of socialism is coercion. However, the point on ownership here, when it comes to socialism, ownership is based on communal ownership, right? So if you don't understand communal ownership, and I've seen these people arguing in favour of, you know, libertarian socialism or whatever type of socialism they may argue for, the reality is there is no other socialism. The only socialism that you have is communal ownership. And to give you an example of the fault of communal ownership in the real world, that is, not the theoretical nonsense that these kids come up with on YouTube who don't even understand the ideology themselves, but the actual real world examples of communal ownership, not the likes of these libertarian socialists, which is an oxymoron. But the fact that these libertarian socialists are trying to correlate socialism with personal ownership of possessions tells you they don't understand the first thing about socialism. Because what does the word personal mean? Personal basically means it's to the individual, right? Individual ownership. It basically means, you know, you have the individual who's able to own their own possessions, right? So that's a big part, shall we say, of course, of, you know, of what personal ownership means. Now that's got nothing to do with socialism. Socialism is the rejection of that. That's what socialism is. Socialism does not accept individual ownership at all. It's the complete rejection of it. And then I'll get to the comments in a second. But the historical example, like I've pointed out numerous times before, if you look at, for example, the period of the starving time, and this was before the Industrial Revolution in North America, when of course in Jamestown in 1607 you saw 104 Jamestown Pilgrim settlers settled into the Virginia Tidewater region, and it was this triangular settlement. Now, they were settled into that settlement. Surrounding them was a large quantity of seafood, so they were surrounded by all the seawater. So they had a large quantity of seafood surrounding them. They also had deer and turkey to fetch for. They had fertile soil, so they could grow their own food. However, despite 104 pilgrims having been settled into Jamestown in 1607, within the space of 6 months, they died due to starvation or disease. Now, the very reason for why that is was to do with communal ownership. Again, 2 years later, they resettled Jamestown by about 500 pilgrims. And again, within 6 months, a staggering 440 of them had died due to starvation and disease. Now, the very reason for why this happened, someone had just recently made the comment and they said, well, technology would solve this problem. Well, no, the answer is not. Technology cannot solve the problem. The problem with communal ownership is the fact that everything that is to be produced is to be put into a communal pool, right? So there's no individual ownership at all. There's no individual possessions. There's no ability for the individual to work for the fruits of their own labour. This was the cause of the starvation. In fact, an historian, I'm pretty sure it's Bethel, in the 19th century or whatever, or 18th century, one of the two, he mentioned, of course, looking back in that period, that the pilgrims did not have the ability to work for the fruits of their own labour. Sir Thomas Dale, a High Marshal, was sent across from Great Britain, and he immediately identified the problem of what led to their starvation, and it was, of course, the communal ownership of property. The cause of the starvation was the free rider problem. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of the socialist classroom experiment. It's basically the idea that if you give everybody, or if you guarantee everybody's going to just get the same grade, then at the end of the day, what would be the point in studying hard? What would be the point in, even the hardest working of people, doing anything if they know they're just going to get the same as the rest of them? There's nothing to be rewarded for, so you're not going to work hard. Well, it's no different to this of the free rider problem with regards to communal ownership, because they didn't have the ability to work for the fruits of their own labour. Why is that? Because there was no secure private property rights. If you don't have secure private property rights, there is no individual ownership. There's no ability for the individual to own their own possessions. So whenever you hear a libertarian socialist saying that, socialism's about individuals getting to buy their own goods, or individuals, having their own possessions, etc., personal ownership of possessions, they don't understand socialism. The very reason why in the Soviet Union you saw somewhat of a market where, individuals could go and buy what the state produced or mass produced, is because the Soviet Union could not 100% reject capitalism. It was capitalism to some degree in this strongly economy that was socialist. It was capitalism that had to prop it up to a varying degree, because without the presence of capitalism to some extent, it would have collapsed far sooner. Of course, they even had a price system. However, it was using price fixing. That's the part that was socialist, etc. And of course the central planning of the means of production, collective ownership, etc. All of those things define socialism. So the harsh reality is, using the example of the starving time with, of course, the pilgrims, the consequences was it led to the starvation, and it was because they could not work for the fruits of their own labour. That was the inevitability of the whole thing, because the free rider problem, what they discovered was what the Bethel, the historian, had written: even the hardest working of people lost the will to live. They died due to starvation and disease, and the reason why they lost the incentive to work hard is because they knew that regardless of how hard they would work, they knew that they would get, nothing greater than what the person who worked less. So, for example, what the free rider problem means is, it means that someone would be free riding off the back of others. So, let's take this for example. Since there's no individual ownership, and we're speaking about communal ownership of possessions, in other words, socialism, it basically means that, let's just say you're working in the collective, and everything that's to be produced is to be put into a collective, communal pool. And then let's say that one individual decides to drop their work rate by 50%. Now, that individual that drops their work rate by 50% is still going to get more or less the same as the rest of them. When the rest of them discover that this individual is going to get exactly the same for pretty much, 50% less work rate, then of course their work rate begins to drop, because they start to think to themselves, what's the point me knocking my pan in only to, turn out with the same results as this person who's working 50% less work rate than the rest of us. So their work rate begins to drop. And you see, what it does is it drags everybody down collectively. And that is precisely why it led to the starvation and disease, despite having a large, quantity of seafood surrounding them, the deer in Turkey, the fertile soil. That's why in 6 months, out of 104 Pilgrim settlers in 1607, only 38 of them had survived. Again, out of the 500 that were resettled 2 years later, 440 of them had died due to starvation and disease. Now, that is significant. And what that is telling you is exactly the problem, the consequences of that of communal ownership. Now, socialism, as I said, is got absolutely nothing at all to do with individual ownership. Any socialist who tries to correlate socialism with anything other than communal ownership haven't got a clue what socialism is. Individualism and collectivism are opposites. Socialism is collectivist. It's a collectivist system. It's based on collective ownership. It's based on communal ownership. What on earth has communal ownership, has collective ownership got to do with personal ownership of possessions? Personal is individual. It's pertaining to individual ownership, the individual's ability to own their own possessions. It requires the secure private property rights. Now, there was an example of that of what you saw with Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. And in this funny, humorous experiment that you saw in Seattle was the very problem of what happens when you blur the lines of secure private property rights. Because in this example of what they, thought they could achieve with anarchy ended up turning into chaos. There was all sorts of violence. Now, it was spoken about that before the Industrial Revolution, the only way, and of course collectivism dominated the planet Earth for thousands of years before the Industrial Revolution, and the only way that they could obtain wealth before the Industrial Revolution was through violence. In other words, kind of like what you saw of all the invasions. It's why all the wars occurred. It's why you saw the Viking invasions, etc. It's because the only way you could obtain wealth in those days was mostly through plunder. Basically exactly what you saw of all the wars and whatnot. So when you look at the example of the Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and the humanist part was, it turned to violence and all sorts. And there was one particular instance where an individual was really, really upset. No, in fact, we'll use two examples. One example was an individual who took it out of his own self-interest to start vandalising a building by spray painting a building. And then along came, specific individuals to then, gang up on the individual and then started to try to what they call self-policing, right? So they tried to, enact that. Of course, it would result in violence, etc. But never mind that point. There was one particular instance where an individual's car was vandalised. And of course his property had been, destroyed, which was his car. And he was looking for his car key, right? He was looking for his car key. It had basically been stolen, and he's losing the plot. Why is that? Well, the reality is this is the very reason why you have secure private property rights. Your private ownership, which is your personal possessions, your car, or whatever it may be. It's protected under your individual rights, your individual secure private property rights. Now, whether you argue for that of a private court system and you argue for anarchism, or maybe you're a minarchist or a classical liberal and you may believe in having the presence of a government, the role of government in a capitalist system, therefore, would be to serve and protect the individual, to basically protect your private property rights, so that if somebody does try to thieve from you, then you can take them to court. Right? So when you take away the private property and you try their experiment, what ends up happening is individuals seek their own self-interest. Now, this is something that socialists have never understood. They live inside their head and they try to reject the real world of human beings. You see, collectivists don't live in the real world. And no matter how they feel, no matter what they live inside their own head, they don't accept the real world. And it's not something they're ever going to be able to change. Because in the real world, individuals are self-interested. And this is a problem that they are faced with, because it defies socialism even by its theory. Because socialism would require, getting rid of the state, theoretically, and it would require people to work collectively, theoretically, and for, without a government, that magically they're going to prevent the private sector from returning. In other words, to prevent individuals going and doing their own thing. They can't have that, because you can't have individual ownership under socialism. That's why it requires dictatorship. So when you look at the example, when there was no secure private property rights in their practical example, in the Chaz Capital Autonomous Zone, you saw the car was vandalised, because individuals seek their own self-interest. They think, oh well, it's no longer his property, I can just do whatever I like, I can just go into his car, take his car key, vandalise his car, because, who's to stop me? There's no government, I can just do whatever I like now. I'm in this, shared commune, I can do whatever I like, and there's nothing you can do about it, because anything that's in here, it belongs to all of us. It's no longer a case that, it's the individual. And if you dare to even think of having your own individual self-interest and having your own individual possessions, and you try to protect that, well, they will say, you're greedy, you're self-centred. You see, that's the argument you get from socialists. So let me go through some of the comments that I got, and of course, I do thank you, of course. As you mentioned, nowadays those yeah, that was the one I read. And as you mentioned about that of Vladimir Lenin admits that the communism requires an authoritarian government. Yeah, he did. He basically stated in his own words, the goal of socialism is communism. You even had the words of a Fabian socialist, the founder of, or a founder of the, Fabian Society, and that was George Bernard Shaw. And George Bernard Shaw, a staunch socialist, came out and said, socialism is the same as communism, only in better English. He pretty much said something along those lines. And it was his way of saying that, he says it's better English, right? Socialism is the same as communism, only in better English. In other words, what he's saying is, if you feed people communism, at the end of the day, well, they'll never accept it. But if you feed people socialism, which is to do with gradualism, they will accept the gradual loss of their freedom over a lengthy period of time. He understood that, but of course that's something that socialists don't. As you said, Vladimir, that's the one I had read. And as you said, minimum wage causes price inflation and unemployment. Yeah, I mean, that's something without question. And Keynesian government regulations create barriers for entry in the current market, in the market, meaning poor people can't start their own business. Yeah, I mean, Keynesianism is basically quasi-socialism. It strangles the market through using socialism, and it's basically economic fascism of what it is in practice. Initially, Keynesianism wasn't meant to be. Initially, Keynesianism was only meant to be used as a temporary measure during that of an economic crisis, but in practice, Keynesianism was used and abused by the Socialists using fractional reserve banking, the continual printing, borrowing and spending, even during times of when the economy was doing better, and all the stimulus, programs, all the, bailouts, etc. It was the Keynesianism, in other words, that resulted in the cause of the banking crisis. Just like the subsidies of the 19th century, it would result in the hundreds of companies facing bankruptcy. Well, it was no different with the banking crisis. At the end of the day, all the bank bailouts caused the bad banks to become too big to fail. It led to, legally protected fraud. They became incompetent. They were getting away with, issuing out the cheap credit, etc., and the fraudulent behaviour, and it was all because of the fact that their losses were continuously being protected by government. So government is partly responsible for that because it took the risk away from the creditors. So that's what results in incompetency and legally protected fraud. It most certainly was never caused by deregulation. I mean, the banks were over-regulated, as I've said before. So yeah, I mean, that was that comment. Let's just see. As you said, a worker union can be a capitalist who produces exchange profit. Fury appeal. As you said, Vladimir Lenin, his Bolsheviks colleagues were involved terrorism with history advancing under Tsar administration. Well, that's the thing. I mean, he was an evil man. I mean, there's no denying the fact that, between 1921 and 22, he led 5 million people to starvation. It was done on purpose. It was all to try and usher in and try the testing of the new man, to try and create the new man. They really were. They were supporters of mass genocide. In other words, they were just basically Marxists. As you say, we'll be back. Do you think that socialists believe on the communal ownership due to the misrepresentation of history, as Hoppe puts it? Yes. You see, this is the thing, because, and it's just like Tom Woods had argued, and he stated this, and it's absolutely bang on. What he once stated was the fact that what influences people in the direction of, their political views, to supporting the mixed economy, to supporting, socialism, is the Industrial Revolution. Now, it's, as he stated, and it's so true, it's often people's perception of a specific given time period of history that helps shape and influence their political views. And it's the very reason why too many people today are politically indoctrinated, because they've been lied to on a scale so massive that you wouldn't believe it. In other words, the Industrial Revolution, I cannot think of a period in history that has been lied about more than that period of history. For example, the living conditions. No one denies the fact that the living conditions were awful if you were to compare today's living conditions to back then. And like the economic historians of the Mises Institute pointed out, one of the biggest faults of these historians, or most historians you see today, They don't understand economics, and that's quite a big problem. Not only that, it's the fact that they tried to compare today's living conditions and wages to that period of history, and you can't do that. It's just like there was another economic historian of the Mises Institute, and he rightly pointed out, if you want to measure progress, you look at what life was like before then, and then measure it to, say, for example, the 1840s. So if you want to measure progress, you look at the 1400s, the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s, and then you look at the 1840s and make the comparison. Then you can see whether there's been progress or not. You don't look at the 1840s and say, oh well, look at the living, conditions and the wages, and then start comparing it to today's living wages and conditions, etc. It's completely and wholly irrational. So, like I say, that period of history, so much had been lied about. For example, the child labour. They tried to say that it was due to they tried to say that it's due to government legislation that was the reason for your work week hours reducing, which is simply not true. Because suppose that was the case, right? Let's suppose that was the case. And let's suppose that the Industrial Revolution never happened, and that you were living in the 1750s, and then government, for whatever reason being, decided to come along with legislation to cut your working hours by 40 odd hours, right? After all, before the Industrial Revolution, people were working more than 80 hours per week, weren't they? So, what if government came along with legislation then and cut the working hours by about 40 odd, 40 odd hours? Well, what do you think would happen? The reality is they would die of starvation. It would cause mass genocide. You see, the reason why they were working more than 80 hours per week wasn't because, of anything to do with factories, or they were just forced into that position. It's because the fact that it took you longer to do specific jobs in the daily life, using specific tools in your hands, compared to what you have the luxury of today. In other words, that is to say, in common sense, in simple English terminology and simple English language, the machines enabled you not only to mass produce, the machines enabled you to multitask, to reduce your working hours. For example, take for example how people used to store food. You used to have to store food underground, whereas today you now have the luxury of refrigerators. Or take for example how you now have things like washing machines or dishwashers, etc, etc. So you can do multitasking, you can dramatically reduce your working hours because of machines. That's what enabled the reduction of the working hours. It also enabled your population to grow in size because more was able to be produced, for example food, and therefore because food was able to be stored longer, such as because of the refrigerators, then of course through all of these innovations, it enabled the population to grow, people's living conditions improved, all of these things. It was because of capitalism. It's not because some government decided to just come along and say, well, you know what, we'll just stick down our legislation to cut the working hours and that's it. And nothing could be further from the truth, because we've got the evidence of the United States of America and American history to prove that evidence, because even when it came to child labour legislation in the United States, the working hours were being reduced, families were getting richer, and children were being kept out of the dangerous workplace long before child labour laws came into fruition. Now, how was it that the families were able to, send their children home and off to school long before child labour laws? Because the wages were improving. It was in America, it was improving by 1.6% per year on average, and of course the working hours were being reduced. So the mothers had the luxury to send their children off to school. So this is the thing. It's a period of history, as I say, that's been lied about so much to a point that because of all of the lies, people have bought into all of the bullshit. They've bought into all of the crap. For example, they believed all the nonsense that the rich got richer and poor got poorer, which wasn't true. They believed all the myths to do with the robber barons, the famous robber barons, where they said that, these industries held all these evil monopolies and shafted the consumer. Again, it wasn't true. They believed the nonsense that these factories poorly mistreated children and beat them, etc. Again, it wasn't true. Now, the children who were poorly mistreated were the orphans, and who did the orphans live under? The state. It was the state that poorly mistreated them. So this is the thing, because all it takes is for people to misinterpret history, to misinterpret a period of history, and all of a sudden, because people buy into all of that nonsense, then they believe, oh, this is the reason why we need government. This is the reason why we need government to do this and government to do that, because if we don't have government to do this, that and the next thing, then of course all hell would break loose. So that explains, the basis of why that is. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, like I said, with regards to the whole thing, it's why people are led into this path of the whole collectivism, and it's a very sad thing, because although he was a socialist, Albert Einstein said doing the same thing over and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. And sadly, despite the fact that the starving time existed before the Industrial Revolution, despite the fact that the enclosure movement to a degree had saved people's lives because of private ownership, it's what put an end to the periodical famines. Despite that evidence, there it was, moving into the 20th century, they repeated history. And what happened as a result of the centralisation of agriculture? More than 40 million people died of starvation in China. Look at the millions that died in the Soviet Union. You could even look at the Juche idea in North Korea. And it's the story and history of what happens when people turn a blind eye to history and think that their good intentions mean more than that of than economics itself. And that's the danger with, of course, the socialists. So yeah, I mean, that explains that. And of course, as Pee-wee mentions, money is important because it makes it more easy to transport goods and makes it possible to obtain information about profits and losses through price signals in order to allocate resources efficiently. I mean, you're exactly right. Again, it's the very reason why socialism is destructive. All their good intentions, for example, their good intentions, and I didn't really go into detail on it on a few of the other videos there, but their good intentions, for example, would be, to lower prices artificially of, rented housing. Now, there was a recent video, I can't remember who it was, I think it was Second Thought that made the argument on the rented housing, and he's talking about them holding the white sheets outside. Well, that's all well said and done. But at the end of the day, the reason why I left this out is because it would go into detail. And the bottom line is, you go down the road with those consequences, you artificially, and the key word there is artificially lower the price below market value. You're creating a price shortage problem. It's exactly what leads to a housing shortage crisis. And it's the same thing with the food shortage crisis. It's the same thing. That's what price ceilings do. And that's basically it. I mean, you're absolutely spot on with that. It's one of the reasons why socialism is so destructive. As Fury Appeal says, by the way, Lenin, the Bolsheviks, backstabbed and overthrown democratically elected party who were his allies, Socialist Voluntary Party, a moderate socialist. And of course, PV, as you said, Scotty communists like Jason Unruh will call anyone that's right to them a fascist, including Social Democrats. Yeah, I mean, they like to use these terms, left and right and all the rest of it, but the bottom line is, fascists were collectivists. That's what a fascist is. Fascism was a political system that subordinates that of individual rights. It subordinates the individual. It's based on collective control of the means of production, which defines socialism. It involves economic central planning, which again defines socialism. Okay, it might have used the private sector, but what does it do? The state, the government, uses strong government regulation to give the state the power to collectively control the private sector, to basically collectively control the means of production. Because after all, you might like to believe that you're the private owner of your company, but if the state is the one dictating and controlling everything, if the state is the one dictating and controlling how much you produce, what you produce, who you can employ, how many people you can employ, the machinery your workers can use, the height they can work at, all the safety regulations that are involved with it, or, stuff to do with how many hours they work, etc, etc, etc. If the state controls all of that, who's the real owner of the company? And then on top of that, if the government is earning more in your business through taxation, who's the real owner? Well, it's the government. That's the real owner of the company. So they don't like that, of course. They like to pretend that somehow fascism's the same as fascism's the same as capitalism, and it really isn't. Just because the fact it uses a private sector, it doesn't mean to say it's the same. So that covers that. As you mentioned, we'll be back. Oh my god, libertarian socialist is an oxymoron. Yeah, exactly, it is. It's an oxymoron because how on earth, and you could ask them the question over and over, and it's like I said, I mean, these people really are irrational. You ask them the question, well, okay, let's hypothetically speaking, say that you get rid of the private sector 100% through the dictator. Who's to say the state is just going to wither away? And then, hypothetically speaking, let's say that as if by magic, that the state did just so happen to wither away. Well, okay then, since there's no government and society is made up of individuals, who is going to stop individuals going and doing their own thing? Who's going to stop individuals going and starting up their own private business? Well, there you have it. Because the only thing that they can then do is to create a group of people, which is a committee, to then oversee, to regulate that. And if you're creating a committee, if you're creating a central body of people to oversee, to govern what other individuals are doing, that by definition is governance. So it's a myth. The entire basis of their entire ideologies is a myth. There's no such thing as this, libertarian socialism. It really is an oxymoron. And they tried to correlate personal ownership of possessions, as I said, with libertarian socialism, and it's irrational because socialism is defined around communal ownership of property, and that means the complete rejection of all individual ownership completely. And as you said, PV, I've once seen self-proclaimed libertarian market socialists say that the massacre of the Romanov children is justified. It's crazy. It's just, I don't know if I covered it there, but I think I cut it out in my recent video there. And one of the things that I left out, and I've mentioned before, socialists, no joke, the ones who visited the Soviet Union, the pilgrims from the West, who visited the Soviet Union during its, honeymoon period in the 1930s. They literally visited the labour camps and they painted it as happy, peaceful places. As if it was just, nothing wrong, right? These were places where thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people were massacred. And they did the same thing with North Korea. Now, these concentration camps in North Korea, I think it was Beatrice, I can't remember her full name, but she was from the Fabian Society. She visited that of North Korea, and she mentioned about the concentration camps, or whatever, the labour camps, and how she described it was there was no walls, as if to paint it as just a place that people who did bad things just go to a specific place, a wee quiet place, to sit down and have a think about what they did wrong. That's the way they painted it, right? As if to say that their version of a prison wasn't really a prison. It was just a place that they would just go out in the middle of nowhere or something and somehow just think about what they did wrong. Literally, right? See if they can really twist reality and literally create something up inside their own head based on that. That will tell you the very reason why socialists, do not accept, the failure of things like North Korea or Venezuela or Cuba. Why, you get someone claiming that Cuba is a democratic country? Because these people live in an alternative universe in their own head. They don't live in the real world. They're very dangerous that way. So yeah, that was that comment. As you said, Scotty, thoughts on nuclear energy? I am in full support of it. Look, at the end of the day, there's no hard evidence over this whole thing to do with climate change. There isn't. Okay? There really isn't. And see, to be brutally honest with you, all this complete and utter bullshit about moving towards this solar power, etc., etc., and the other sources of power, moving towards renewable resources. Well, first of all, how's that going to work out in a country like Scotland, where we don't really see much of the sun? We're not a country like the United States of America. We're not a country like Italy. This is Scotland. When do we ever get to see the sun? You're lucky. During the summer, there's a lot of, overcast days. There's even days where a lot of the time you might find rain, right? Welcome to Scotland. So how would that work out in a country like Scotland, with solar power? And apparently the solar power only gives out about, a fraction of the energy, about 30 odd to about 40 odd % of the energy. That's no use. So I don't agree with this whole thing on the climate change. It's a scam, right? So don't get me wrong. It's important that we look after the environment. It's important that we make improvements and technological advancements to continuously improve. For example, cleaning up our oceans and getting rid of the plastic waste from the oceans. And it's actually thanks to capitalism that's finding innovative ways to turn plastics, grinding it down, using, the plastic waste into roads in England, for example. And there's other ways that they've found ways to turn the plastics into edible things. So, yeah, that's what we mean. This is what we should be looking towards. The market, in terms of finding ways to continuously improve, the way things are done. But with that being said, we should not sacrifice our economic living standards simply because of something that they have no proof over. None. Right? The CO2 levels during the period of the Roman Empire was far higher then than it is today. The CO2 levels of going back 500,000 odd years ago was twice as high as it is today. Yet despite that fact, was there any extinction, as Extinction Rebellion call themselves? No, there wasn't. I think it was the oyster population? I can't remember what it was. It's these, creatures in the ocean that would harden their shells, and they would harden their shells to adapt to their environment, and over thousands of years they would adapt and change. So it's really all nonsense, so to speak, right? And geologists would agree, as of course Tony Heller, I'm pretty sure his name is, as he's pointed out numerous times before. At the end of the day, when it comes down to it, the geologists agree that it is basically down to temperature that drives CO2, not the other way around. It's not the CO2 that is driving temperature. It's the temperature that's driving the CO2, which of course would explain the large usage of fossil fuels, why there would be a change, of course, to do with CO2. But the CO2 is not something acidic. It's not something that's harmful to our planet. It's healthy to the planet. I mean, it's a bit like someone saying growing more, and it's quite it's quite hypocritical, that, because on one hand they're saying CO2 is so harmful, but as far as I'm aware, they believe in growing more trees, and I'm not someone who's completely into science, etc. I don't follow into it all. I'm not a scientist. I've never took interest in it, but from research I looked at before, I'm pretty sure there was some, to some degree. I know that it can absorb CO2, but I'm pretty sure there was, to a certain degree, it can give off. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. I don't follow everything to do with science. I'm not an expert, but you guys would certainly know perhaps more information than I particularly do on certain issues. Tony Heller is someone I trust more because he's an actual scientist, and when it comes to things like that. But even to that varying degree, it's the very fact that they're claiming that CO2 is going to be so harmful to our planet, and it doesn't make sense. And it also doesn't make sense because, and this plays into the consequences of their damage on the market. For example, the move away from, in the automobile industry, the move away from your normal cars running on petrol, and whatever, the move. Sorry, it's nothing to do. It's the move away. The move away from your normal cars. Of course, I don't own a car. I don't drive yet or that. It's basically the move that they have towards the electrical motors. You know what I'm talking about. And the point that I'm addressing here is the fact that with the electrical motors, they give off more CO2. So, I don't understand the point. In fact, if it's giving it off more CO2, it'd be healthy. But it's the fact that what they're doing is using, again, socialism to manipulate the market to force the automobile industry into a general direction when it could be just left free to the free market and let the free market decide. That's the problem that I've got with the whole thing. Again, I'm not entirely clued up in everything, so to speak, but I do know that from research I have done, with the electrical motors, they give out more CO2, so it's, the whole thing's it's a waste of money. That's what it is. The whole thing's a scam, right? So, I'm in support of the nuclear energy and whatever. So I just thought I would obviously do my rant for today, and because obviously I was testing this thing out as well, because I just got this today. Not the microphone, of course, but the foam windshield thing. So that's good. I hope it's not created any sort of implosions with P's and B's and stuff, but yeah, whatever. Anyway, folk, I'm just going to jump off and do some other stuff. But I will, of course, get around to planning whatever my next video is going to be at some point. Like I said, between that, I kind of get around to looking at some Udemy stuff and whatever, and I'll get around to that. I just felt like going on a rant today because I wasn't really doing much else today, so yes, I just thought I would use that time up. And obviously it's been an interesting discussion and whatever. And yeah, hopefully I'll obviously catch up with yous on other comments and stuff like that and my videos. So yeah. Catch yous later, folks, and obviously I'll get round to doing other videos. Cheers.